What if history isn't random? What if the strangest moments in American history, the twin deaths on Independence Day, the mirror assassinations, the dogs named Fido, aren't just coincidences, but echoes in this 2-hour descent into the bizarre? We unravel 49 eerie parallels that make the past feel like a script on loop. Presidents, disasters, revolts, and revolutions, all stitched together by uncanny timing and unsettling patterns. You thought you knew U.S. history? Think again. This isn't a documentary. It's a ghost story written in facts. Welcome to 49 Strangest Coincidences in U.S. History. Let's begin. Lincoln and Kennedy assassinations. There are coincidences. And then there are the Lincoln-Kennedy ones. The kind that makes you squint suspiciously at reality, like it's trying too hard to set up a plot twist. Abraham Lincoln was elected in 1860. John F. Kennedy? 1960. Lincoln was shot in Ford's Theater. Kennedy was shot in a Lincoln, made by Ford. Lincoln's assassin shot him in a theater and fled to a warehouse. Kennedy's assassin shot him from a warehouse and fled to a theater. That's not irony. That's performance art. Lincoln had a secretary named Kennedy. Kennedy had a secretary named Lincoln. They were both shot in the head on a Friday. They were both accompanied by their wives. Their assassins were both killed before they could stand trial. Both presidents were succeeded by men named Johnson, Andrew, and Lyndon. Both Southerners, both former senators, and both, curiously, not great at keeping the country from unraveling. And here's the kicker. Booth was born in 1839. Oswald in 1939. This is either a poorly hidden matrix glitch or history playing Mad Libs with itself. Of course, rational historians chalk it all up to coincidence. Pattern recognition gone feral. The human brain connecting dots because it can't stand the idea that chaos rules the narrative. But even they sound unconvinced, mumbling into their beards while nervously adjusting their glasses. The Lincoln-Kennedy coincidences are so neat, so perfectly eerie. They feel like the kind of thing a lazy screenwriter would write into a time travel movie before being told to tone it down. And yet, they're real. They happened. No fiction here. Just America being weird. And the punchline? We still argue about both assassinations. Still whisper about second shooters and missing pages and secret cabals. But maybe the biggest mystery isn't who killed them. It's why their lives felt like mirrored scripts in the first place. And while we're on the topic of death with a flair for the dramatic, let's talk about two founding fathers who couldn't help but upstage Independence Day. Deaths of John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. July 4th, 1826. Fireworks, parades, drunken toasts to liberty, and somewhere amid the patriotic revelry, two of the most important men in American history quietly dropped dead. On the same day. On the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. The thing they helped write. That's not a coincidence. That's a mic drop. John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. Best friends, bitter enemies, best friends again. They were the Lennon and McCartney of American democracy, if Lennon and McCartney had spent decades exchanging letters about political philosophy and also helped found a republic. They were opposites in many ways. Adams, the neurotic Massachusetts lawyer. Jefferson, the aloof Virginian philosopher. But in the end, they died in unison, like synchronized swimmers doing a final morbid pirouette. Adams' last words? Thomas Jefferson survives, except he didn't. Jefferson had died hours earlier. Nobody told Adams because this was 1826 and the Wi-Fi was terrible. People love to romanticize it. Divine timing, fate, a cosmic thank you card for services rendered. But if you take a darker view, and we always do here, it starts to feel a little orchestrated. Like they knew. Like two old men holding on just long enough to exit stage left on the most symbolically potent day in the American calendar. Honestly, if a novelist wrote it that way, you'd call it cheesy. Was it coincidence, mutual patriotism-induced heart failure, or just the world's most elaborate flex. Doesn't matter. It happened. And we'll probably never top it, unless 3 ex-presidents all keel over during a Super Bowl halftime show. What's more unnerving is what it says about myth-making, about how history folds in on itself, creates neat endings, satisfying parallels, and how sometimes those endings are just waiting there, eerie and perfect. And speaking of men from the 1700s doing things that absolutely shouldn't still echo today, let's talk about the president who was born in 1790 and still has a living grandson. Tyler's grandson, John Tyler, was born in 1790. That's just 4 years after the United States Constitution was signed. And as of right now, he still has a living grandson. Not great-great-great-grandchild, not descendant. Grandson. As in, only 2 generations away from a guy who once wore breeches and powdered wigs unironically. The trick? Deeply inappropriate fertility practices. Tyler fathered his last child at the age of 70. That child, Lyon Gardner Tyler Sr., apparently took the baton of late-life parenting and ran with it. Lyon Sr. had children when he was in his 70s, too. One of those children, Lyon Gardner Tyler Jr., lived until 2020. Harrison Ruffin Tyler, another grandson, is still alive as of this writing. He's a real person. You could call him right now. But don't. That's weird. What this means is that one of the original founding fathers, okay, founding father adjacent, is only 2 handshakes away from you. 1 warm Thanksgiving dinner away. It short-circuits your sense of time. It makes you question whether history is really all that historical. And it reminds you that the past isn't behind us. It's still showing up for breakfast and voting in school board elections. It also raises an uncomfortable question. How many other ghosts are still walking around, disguised as little old men? If history can stretch this far forward, what else have we underestimated? Tyler's political career was chaotic. He was the first vice president to ascend to the presidency due to death. No one knew what to call him. Acting president? That guy who's here now? Until Tyler just said, "Nah, I'm president. Deal with it." He set the precedent by sheer audacity, a pattern his descendants clearly continued. And while you're still chewing on that bizarre little time bomb of a family tree, let's pivot to a man who tried to prove his presidential vigor and died 32 days later. Harrison's short tenure and death. William Henry Harrison. The man, the myth, the 32-day president. The shortest presidency in American history, and possibly the most preventable death by stubbornness ever to grace the Oval Office. It all started with an ego and a coat. March 4th, 1841. Inauguration Day. Cold, windy, miserable. Harrison, a 68-year-old war hero with something to prove, decided that wearing a hat or coat would undermine his macho image. After all, what's pneumonia compared to looking soft? Then came the speech. Oh, the speech. At nearly 2 hours long, 8,445 words, it was the longest inaugural address ever delivered. He rambled about ancient Rome, the Constitution, and whatever else crossed his mind. The audience slowly froze. Even the horses looked bored. But Harrison was determined. This was his moment. He was going to out-president all the other presidents, except, for the living part. 32 days later, he was dead. Pneumonia, they said. Though modern scholars have speculated it might have been enteric fever due to White House plumbing issues. Whatever the cause, Harrison went from president to ghost faster than anyone else in U.S. history. And here's where the coincidence kicks in. His death kicked off a centuries-long question about presidential succession. No one knew what to do. The Constitution said the vice president would assume the powers and duties, but not whether he actually became president. John Tyler said, "Yeah, I do," and locked the door behind him. Thus began the Tyler precedent, which conveniently made its way into law over a century later. Not bad for a guy who got the job because someone else refused to wear a coat. Even better, the last words Harrison supposedly uttered were to his doctor. "Sir, I wish you to understand the true principles of the government. I wish them carried out. I ask nothing more beautiful, poetic, inspiring, and completely ignored by his own party." In the end, Harrison's legacy is a paradox. A man who spent decades building his career and became most famous for dying before he could do anything. If nothing else, he proved that weather, hubris, and outdated plumbing are more powerful than ambition. But speaking of presidents and oddly specific similarities, did you know Lincoln and Kennedy also named their dogs Fido? Lincoln's dog and Kennedy's dog. It sounds like a punchline. Two assassinated presidents separated by a century, both naming their dogs Fido. What are the odds? Not metaphorically, literally. Both men revered, mourned, turned into marble statues of democratic martyrdom. Had a floppy-eared Fido. Abraham Lincoln's Fido was a yellowish mutt with a tendency to beg at the dinner table. A true family dog. So beloved, in fact, that Lincoln left him behind in Springfield when he went to Washington, fearing the bustle and fireworks of D.C. would scare the poor pup. Instead, Fido stayed with a family friend. He was pampered, fed table scraps, treated like royalty. Until one day, after Lincoln's assassination, a drunk man stabbed Fido to death. Yes, really, that's how the presidential dog saga ended. With an absurd, tragic stab wound. History doesn't do gentle exits. Kennedy's Fido, on the other hand, wasn't quite as prominent. There's some confusion around the name. JFK had several dogs, including a poodle named Golly, a terrier named Charlie, and Pushinka, a gift from Khrushchev. But in personal correspondence and oral histories, one of the family's dogs is referred to as Fido, too. A coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe someone at the CIA was running a deep psychological experiment in canine nomenclature. In Latin, Fido means "I trust," which is ironic given that both men were betrayed. Lincoln by his country's divisions, Kennedy by a rifle shot from above. Two presidents, two Fidos, two tragedies. It's as if they both tried to hold on to something simple. Something pure, a dog, a name, a small piece of warmth in a violent world. The symbolism is unsettling. In the end, even their dogs weren't safe. But maybe this whole thing with presidents and mortality isn't new. Because long before JFK ducked into a motorcade, another president was dodging bullets and slapping would-be assassins with his cane. And he didn't have a Fido. He had rage. Andrew Jackson's assassination attempt and duel. Andrew Jackson, America's angry grandfather. A man powered entirely by whiskey, bullets, and unprocessed trauma. The seventh president was the human equivalent of a fever dream with a sword. And yes, someone tried to kill him. It did not go well. The year was 1835. The place, the U.S. Capitol. A painter named Richard Lawrence waited by a pillar with two pistols. As Jackson passed by, Lawrence stepped forward, pointed his gun, and pulled the trigger. Click. Misfire. Undeterred, Lawrence pulled a second pistol. Click. Another misfire. That's when Jackson, 67 years old, turned around, stormed toward the man, and proceeded to beat him savagely with his cane. The president didn't run. He didn't duck. He went full chaos gremlin on his would-be assassin in the middle of the Capitol rotunda. It took several men to pull him off. Later testing showed that both pistols were in working condition. The chances of two misfires in perfect weather, astronomically low. Some say divine intervention. Others say pure Jacksonian spite. Reality itself refusing to let him go that easily. But this wasn't Jackson's first brush with mortality. Decades earlier, he fought a duel with Charles Dickinson. Dickinson was a crack shot. He hit Jackson in the chest. Jackson, bleeding and still standing, slowly raised his pistol and killed Dickinson. He lived with the bullet in his body for the rest of his life. Occasionally, he'd cough blood. That's not dramatic flair. That's just Tuesday for Andrew Jackson. This was a man who was shot so many times in his life that his body whistled when he turned too fast. He carried a pistol ball near his heart and never let go of a grudge. His assassination attempt is less a near miss and more a failed boss fight. And the real mystery? How did a man that violent, that irate, that allergic to compromise, survive so long in a role that requires diplomacy? But don't worry, America has always been good at contradictions. Just ask the slave-holding founding fathers who wrote "All men are created equal." Founding fathers and slavery. Let's talk about freedom. Glorious, liberty-loving, revolution-igniting freedom. Now let's ruin it with a harsh truth. Many of the men who declared all men are created equal owned other people. It's not a footnote. It's the foot in the door. George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, Patrick Henry, champions of liberty by day, plantation bosses by night. This wasn't a minor oversight. This was a system they built, benefited from, and intellectually sidestepped with gymnastic moral justifications. Jefferson, who wrote that all men have a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, also wrote that black people were inferior and shouldn't mix with whites. He fathered children with Sally Hemings, a woman he enslaved, and never freed her during his lifetime. It's not ironic. It's calculated hypocrisy. George Washington freed his slaves in his will. A nice gesture for a man who waited until he was dead. Madison, the father of the Constitution, also fathered generations of enslaved workers. For men who worried so much about tyranny, they certainly weren't worried about the chains in their backyards. And yet, these contradictions aren't buried. They're baked in. American freedom was constructed paradoxically on the labor of people who had none. The Constitution, that sacred laminated pamphlet in every civics textbook, counted enslaved people as 3/5 of a person for representation. Not for justice, not for rights, for taxes and congressional seats, the math of power. The real coincidence? That these contradictions weren't exceptional. They were standard, normalized, intellectualized, and it took almost 100 years, a civil war, and another 100 years of civil rights struggle to begin addressing it. The nation that declared itself born in liberty also birthed its own contradictions. And still, the statues stand. The dollar bills, the monuments, the marble. Jefferson gazes from his memorial across the tidal basin, all while his ghost quietly pretends not to hear the questions. So yes, the Founding Fathers gave us ideals worth fighting for, and a system designed to exclude many from those ideals. That isn't irony. That's the American starter pack. But if you think that's cursed, just wait until you hear about the presidents who were elected every 20 years and then mysteriously died. The curse of Tippecanoe, or Tecumseh's curse. Let's get supernatural. The curse of Tippecanoe, also known as Tecumseh's curse, reads like a list of presidential obituaries carved by some vengeful trickster spirit with a pocket calendar. It starts in 1840 when William Henry Harrison, yes, our beloved coat-ignoring speech marathoner, won the presidency after leading U.S. forces in the Battle of Tippecanoe. Bad idea. That victory, according to legend, angered the Shawnee chief Tecumseh and cursed the presidency itself. The terms, every president elected in a year ending in 0 would die in office. 1840, Harrison, dead in 32 days. 1860, Lincoln, boom, theater, gone. 1880, Garfield, shot by a man who thought he deserved a job, bled out slowly, painfully. 1900, McKinley, shot, died after doctors probed his wound with bare hands. Science was still in beta. 1920, Harding. Heart attack? Food poisoning? Affair-related stress? Pick your theory. He died. 1940, FDR. Died in his fourth term, which, wasn't during the 1940 term, but close enough to raise eyebrows. Then came 1960. John F. Kennedy. The pattern held. And America collectively started wondering if the presidency was some kind of high-stakes Final Destination movie. But then, plot twist. 1980, Ronald Reagan. Shot, survived. Barely. Depending on which conspiracy thread you pull, some believe the curse tried to take him, but was thwarted. By what? The Secret Service? Nancy Reagan's astrologer? Sheer, stubborn cowboy vibes? Then came 2000, George W. Bush. 2 terms. No bullets, no fevers, no mysterious heart failure. The curse seemed broken. Or maybe it just got bored. Historians, being historians, dismiss it as coincidence, selective memory, a statistical anomaly. But the deaths lined up too neatly, too consistently. And while rational minds may scoff, the timing makes you pause. What kind of nation produces a pattern like that, and then just keeps voting? More importantly, what happens in 2040? Maybe it's just poetic injustice. A nation founded on conquest, haunted by the ghosts of those it defeated. A loop of fate echoing through time like a drumbeat no one can unhear. But if you think curses are the only thing haunting the White House, just wait. Because some first ladies had to survive their husbands and near blindness. First lady illnesses. Margaret Taylor and Julia Grant weren't just first ladies. They were first-hand witnesses to 19th century Washington's complete disinterest in women's health. Coincidence or pattern? Both suffered severe vision issues while married to military men turned presidents. Because nothing says welcome to the most powerful house in the nation, like watching your vision dim as the political circus lights up around you. Margaret Taylor, wife of President Zachary Taylor, hated the spotlight, and she had an excellent reason to. She could barely see it. She suffered from frequent illness, declining eyesight, and a general desire to be anywhere else. During her husband's brief term, he died after just 16 months, she avoided public events, skipped formal dinners, and reportedly never even hosted a reception. In other words, she ghosted the East Wing before ghosting was cool. Julia Grant, on the other hand, was more visible, figuratively. Literally? Not so much. She was nearly blind due to strabismus, a condition that caused one eye to drift. She wanted corrective surgery before her time as First Lady. Ulysses S. Grant told her no, not because he didn't want her to look different, but because, in his words, I fell in love with that squint, which is either the most romantic or most gaslighty sentence ever uttered in presidential marriage history. Julia adapted. She memorized people's voices, used touch and intuition to navigate conversations, and once reportedly misidentified a visiting dignitary as a member of the kitchen staff. Again, 19th century politics, where the men make speeches and the women try not to trip over the drapes. The coincidence here isn't just their eyesight, it's the quiet resilience. The way these women operated in the background of power, squinting through the fog of male ambition and national expectation. Their vision may have failed, but their presence didn't. And if you think that's oddly metaphorical, just wait. Because the Capitol itself once went up in flames, and then, weirdly enough, caught fire again. The Capitol fire and the British. America's national story is often told in fireworks, grand, explosive, and vaguely dangerous. So it only makes sense that its most sacred building, the U.S. Capitol, has caught fire. Not once, but multiple times. And no, that's not some metaphor about democracy burning. That's actual flames licking the pillars of power. Let's go back to 1814. The War of 1812 is dragging along like a bar fight no one really wanted to start, and the British are fed up. So they do what any deeply offended former colonial parent would do. They torched the capital city. They set the Capitol building ablaze. Torched the Library of Congress, too, because why stop at governance when you can also murder books? It was a humiliation. The symbol of the fledgling republic, engulfed in flames, smoke billowing like a bad omen across the Potomac. It would take years to rebuild, and even longer to shake the image of redcoats casually lighting up democracy with their cigars. Now fast forward to 1998. A small fire breaks out in the Capitol. Completely unrelated. Totally accidental. Barely makes the evening news. But here's the thing. It's the same building. 2 fires, 184 years apart. Both happening in the heart of American government. And while the second one was extinguished quickly and with little damage, it still feels like the building itself remembers. Like the ghosts of burned parchment and singed speeches still haunt the drywall. Coincidence? Sure. But the Capitol is no stranger to symbolic timing. It's where assassinations are mourned, wars are declared, and scandals are whispered. When it catches fire, even by accident, it feels like history coughing up smoke signals. So maybe it's just the wiring. Or maybe history doesn't forget. Maybe the Capitol building, rebuilt, restored, reglossed, is still vulnerable to combustion. Because, like the country it houses, it's always a little flammable. And speaking of holes in continuity, let's talk about the weird phenomenon of vice presidents not being replaced after presidential assassinations. Because nothing says line of succession like an empty chair. Presidential assassinations and their successors vice presidents. When Abraham Lincoln was assassinated in 1865, his vice president, Andrew Johnson, became president. And then, nobody. The vice presidency sat vacant, empty. A heartbeat away from the presidency, and the chair was basically treated like a folding stool in the garage. There if you need it, but otherwise collecting dust. Same thing happened with James Garfield, shot in 1881. Chester A. Arthur takes over. The vice presidency. Once again, crickets. No replacement, no backup. Just vibes and cabinet infighting. Now you might be thinking, wait, shouldn't that be fixed? You'd think, but back then, the U.S. Constitution didn't provide a mechanism for appointing a new vice president midterm. You either got elected with one or you rode solo. Like a presidential Uber with no front seat passenger. This meant for large chunks of American history, the nation ran without a second in command. Which is frankly, bananas. The country was recovering from civil war, wrestling with Reconstruction, inventing barbed wire, and the executive branch was operating like a one-man band with a broken drum. It wasn't until much, much later, after yet another assassination, thanks JFK, that the 25th Amendment finally said, hey, maybe we should fix that. It allowed the president to nominate a new vice president, subject to congressional approval. You know, like a real system. The eerie coincidence here is not just the assassinations, but how the exact same constitutional blind spot played out twice. With no one in the seat, no lessons learned. Lincoln and Garfield died, and their successors just shrugged and kept the office half full. Like someone forgetting to refill the printer toner after a crisis. What does that say about American planning? Or optimism? Or just plain forgetfulness? And on the topic of optimism, let's look at a different kind of coincidence. One where a president tried to send delegates to an international conference, only for that country to later become an obsession of U.S. policy. Monroe and the Panama Congress. James Monroe isn't the flashiest founding father. He didn't invent bifocals, he didn't duel anyone, and he didn't write the Constitution. But he did deliver one of history's most awkward coincidences. A diplomatic overture that echoed far louder than he ever imagined. In 1826, President Monroe tried to send U.S. delegates to the Panama Congress, a meeting of newly independent Latin American nations, mostly former Spanish colonies trying to build something post-imperial. It was bold, ambitious, a step toward a hemispheric alliance. He wanted the U.S. to be the cool older cousin in the Western Hemisphere. Show up, shake hands, maybe share some secret handshakes of democracy. Congress was not thrilled. They dragged their feet, debated, squabbled, and eventually the delegates arrived too late to do anything useful. The moment passed. Everyone went home awkwardly, like the guy who shows up to the party after the keg is gone. But here's the twist. A century later, Panama, the same little country Monroe tried to cozy up to, becomes a geopolitical pressure point. The U.S. orchestrates its independence from Colombia, builds the Panama Canal, controls it, then fights over it. For decades, Panama, in other words, went from missed diplomatic opportunity to obsessive long-distance relationship. The ghost of that failed 1826 Congress seems to linger. It's almost as if the U.S. said, if we can't sit at your table, we're going to own the whole kitchen. The coincidence here isn't just geographical, it's symbolic. A forgotten diplomatic gesture quietly mutating into a foreign policy cornerstone. A soft hello that evolved into military bases and sovereignty disputes. It's tempting to think history is linear, that one thing leads to the next in a clean line. But it's more like a dartboard in the dark. Monroe's aim missed, but the dart still landed. Just not where he thought. And speaking of things missing the mark, but still making headlines, let's talk about two presidents who both had daughters named Alice. And neither of those Alice knew how to behave. Presidential daughters named Alice. Every so often, history offers up an odd symmetry, a little rhyme buried between centuries. And in this case, the rhyme goes, two U.S. presidents separated by over half a century, each had a daughter named Alice. And both Alice were, well, trouble. Glorious, fabulous, untamed trouble. First up, Alice Roosevelt, daughter of Theodore, born into politics, raised in chaos, and determined to set fire to every single social expectation laid at her polished shoes. She smoked cigars in public. She had a pet snake named Emily Spinach. She crashed White House parties, caroused with congressmen, and once buried a voodoo doll of her father's rival in the White House lawn. A reporter once asked what she did at official events. Her reply? If you haven't got anything nice to say about anyone, come sit by me. Theodore Roosevelt, when asked why he couldn't control his daughter, famously replied, I can either run the country or attend to Alice. I cannot possibly do both, which is somehow both a parenting philosophy and an accidental campaign slogan. Now fast forward to Lyndon B. Johnson. His daughter, Alice, though lesser known than the Roosevelt firecracker, had a similar flair for stepping outside the lines. She challenged expectations, openly questioned political positions, and bristled against the pristine pageantry expected of a first daughter. Maybe it's the name, or maybe anyone raised in the echo chamber of presidential ambition can't help but push back. The real coincidence isn't just the name Alice. It's what the Alices did with the leash they were given, which is to say, they chewed through it. Both were born into power and responded not with conformity, but with rebellion. Not dramatic revolution, but social rebellion. Controlled explosions in polite rooms. And let's be honest, being a president's child is already weird enough. But being the daughter of a president, in a country that expected women to smile quietly while wearing pearls, that's a recipe for either repression or mischief. But now that we've named names and rattled the first family tree, let's detour into something far colder. A coincidence not of bloodlines, but of pages, and a book that predicted one of the most infamous disasters in modern history, the Titanic and futility. Let's rewind to 1898. A writer named Morgan Robertson publishes a novella titled Futility, or The Wreck of the Titan. It's a forgotten little pulp tale, poorly reviewed, mostly ignored. The story. an enormous British ocean liner named Titan, deemed unsinkable, hits an iceberg in April while crossing the North Atlantic and goes down. Sound familiar? Now keep in mind, this was published 14 years before the Titanic disaster. And yet, the details line up like a morbid to-do list. Not enough lifeboats, a nighttime collision with an iceberg, high death toll, wealthy passengers, and icy hubris. The name Titan isn't just similar. It's practically a legal gray area. The Titan was 800 feet long. The Titanic, 882. The Titan hit the iceberg 400 miles off Newfoundland. The Titanic, roughly the same. It's the kind of eerie, prediction-adjacent coincidence that makes even the most skeptical minds pause. Not because they believe in clairvoyance, but because it's just too on the nose. People later dubbed Robertson a prophet. He wasn't. He was a shipping nerd. He worked as a merchant marine and wrote sea stories to pay rent. He knew the dangers of overconfidence, the economics of maritime vanity, and the physics of iceberg encounters. He didn't predict the Titanic. He understood how disasters are engineered long before the iceberg ever shows up. But still, the name, the plot, the date, it's like history plagiarized fiction. The real uncanny part? After the Titanic sank in 1912, Futility was republished under a new title, The Wreck of the Titan. Suddenly, people cared. Suddenly, the book sold. Was it a warning? A coincidence? Or just one of those moments where reality folds in on itself, accidentally hitting copy-paste on an old paperback? Either way, it's not the last time we'll see the past quietly rehearsing for the future. And speaking of the Founding Fathers, some of them didn't just predict the world. They helped shape it using lessons from their European pen pals and revolution-adjacent trauma. Let's talk about the not-so-random European influences of the early American elite. Founding Fathers and European conflicts. You've probably heard the sanitized version of the American Revolution. Powdered wigs, freedom eagles, and taxation without representation. But the truth is, many of the Founding Fathers weren't just farmers with pitchforks. They were transatlantic intellectual groupies, men who studied, borrowed, and occasionally stole their political blueprints from European conflicts they either lived through or flirted with from a distance. Take Thomas Jefferson. He spent years in France during the lead-up to the French Revolution. He watched Paris unravel over bread prices and guillotines, and came home with a faint whiff of Jacobinism on his waistcoat. James Madison and Alexander Hamilton were both walking constitutional libraries, fluent in Enlightenment-era political theory and obsessed with balancing tyranny and mob rule. Benjamin Franklin, he partied through half of Europe, charming salons and collecting gossip while shaping diplomatic strategy like a drunk chess master. This wasn't cultural tourism. It was political espionage disguised as vacation. They saw monarchies crumble, republics rise, and populist uprisings devolve into chaos. And then they came home and stitched those lessons into a very peculiar new experiment called America. What's coincidental is how deeply their ideas, forged in response to European trauma, mapped onto a continent that hadn't asked for a republic. The U.S. didn't invent democracy. It rebranded it using French philosophy, Roman nostalgia, and a light sprinkling of Greek fan fiction. Even the structure of American government, the three branches, the bicameral legislature, the distrust of centralized power, reads like a mashup of British Parliament and classical republics, served cold with a side of Enlightenment angst. So when people say the founders were visionaries, that's true, but only if you accept that half their vision was borrowed from the smoking ruins of European empires. They weren't just inventing a country, they were building a remix. And if you think that's eerie, just wait until we dig back into the Lincoln-Kennedy rabbit hole, because we haven't hit bottom yet. The Lincoln-Kennedy connection goes deeper. We've already explored the surface-level mirror dance between Abraham Lincoln and John F. Kennedy, but buckle up. We're not done. Because like any good conspiracy that eats its vegetables, the Lincoln-Kennedy parallels don't just echo, they spiral. The coincidences deepen, bend back around, and start tracing shapes in the fog. Here's a particularly uncanny twist. Lincoln was shot in a theater, and his assassin fled to a warehouse. Kennedy was shot from a warehouse, and his assassin fled to a theater. That's not history rhyming. That's history swapping shoes for dramatic effect. It's like time couldn't decide which scene belonged to which president, so it ran both scripts and hoped no one would notice. Then there's the job descriptions. John Wilkes Booth was a well-known actor, the 1860s version of a moody celebrity with political opinions and killer cheekbones. Lee Harvey Oswald, a warehousing nobody, a political drifter with a rifle and a passport stamp from every wrong place. Booth shot Lincoln in front of an audience. Oswald shot Kennedy in front of a nation. And both assassins were themselves killed before their trials, silenced before they could speak a word in court. One gunned down in a barn, the other, famously, in a police basement. Two disappearances wrapped in finality. Even their middle names, Wilkes and Harvey, are weirdly formal, strangely precise, like characters in a novel that's trying a bit too hard to sound believable. Historians wave all this off, of course. They call it confirmation bias. They say we're stitching together patterns after the fact, cherry-picking data like a bad psychic at a dinner party, maybe. But that doesn't change the fact that the pattern exists, that the deeper you look, the more the edges of reality begin to smudge. It's the unsettling feeling that somewhere in the tangle of history, someone hit copy-paste on a presidential tragedy, shuffled the nouns, and sent it back down the pipeline with a new decade stamped on it. And if you think that's dark, just wait until we meet the First Ladies who didn't make it out of the White House alive. First Lady dying in the White House. They say the White House is haunted. Maybe it's the creaking floors, maybe it's the history, or maybe it's the fact that some of the nation's most visible women, First Ladies draped in lace and duty, didn't make it out alive. Let's start with Caroline Harrison, wife of President Benjamin Harrison. She was a school teacher, a mother, and an advocate for women's education. But when she moved into 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, the grandeur was offset by failing health. In 1892, she died in the White House of tuberculosis. Her death marked the first time a First Lady passed away in the executive mansion. And yes, the newspapers covered it with the same drama they reserve for royal coronations and horse racing scandals. Fast forward to Ellen Axon Wilson, wife of President Woodrow Wilson. Elegant, artistic, and mentally exhausted from the constant moral weight of the presidency. She was suffering from kidney disease and quietly declined behind the curtains of Washington's most photographed home. She died in 1914, becoming the second First Lady to die within those walls. The eerie coincidence? Both of these women died while their husbands were serving. Pillars of private grief inside the most public job in the country. And neither got much rest afterward, figuratively or literally. Ellen's death led to a national outpouring of mourning. Less than a year later, Wilson remarried to another woman named Edith, who would later practically run the presidency during his illness. Because who needs ghosts when you've got Edith Wilson running the executive branch from behind a curtain? But death in the White House isn't just about bodies. It's about presence. These women were figures of warmth, tradition, and social gravity. Their death stained the walls quietly, like tea on a tablecloth. Hard to see at first, impossible to scrub out later. And if you believe the stories, their spirits never left. Guests have reported cold spots, soft voices, piano keys moving on their own. But the real haunting is political, a reminder that even in the seat of power, some stories end with grief, not glory. And speaking of sorrowful echoes through time, let's visit the ghost of George Washington, who left behind a warning America has spent centuries ignoring. Washington's farewell address and isolationism. George Washington, the man, the myth, the marble obelisk. As he prepared to ride off into retirement, which for him involved literally going back to a plantation, he gave the nation one final gift, a farewell address. Think of it as the original Do Not Disturb sign for American foreign policy. In this speech, Washington warned against permanent alliances, entangling foreign interests, and the seductive nonsense of partisanship. In other words, don't do anything stupid, I'm out. His advice, stay neutral, mind your business. Avoid turning the young republic into a chess piece on Europe's board. And for a while, America listened. Sort of. There were scuffles and saber rattling, but generally the U.S. kept to its own hemisphere, waving politely at global crises from across the Atlantic. The eerie coincidence is how Washington's plea for isolationism kept returning like a ghostly echo. In the 19th century, during war after war in Europe, America shrugged and said, "Hard pass." Even World War I took years of hand-wringing before we joined. And even then, the public hated it so much we built an entire league of isolationist sentiment afterward. Washington's voice, literally reprinted every year in newspapers for decades, haunted the decision-making. Then came World War II, Pearl Harbor, mass mobilization, and America finally tore off the neutral label like a bandage that had been stuck on too long. We embraced global alliances, international leadership, and, ironically, endless entanglements. Exactly what George warned about. And yet, Washington's words still echo in debates today. Every military intervention, every foreign policy quagmire, every awkward handshake at a summit. Someone inevitably dusts off that farewell address and mutters, "We were warned." The coincidence isn't just historical, it's philosophical. A president who never belonged to a political party warning about the dangers of political factions. A general who knew war, pleading for peace, and a republic, young and stupid, promising it would never forget, only to promptly forget. And while we're on the subject of forgetting, let's talk about two massive American cities that forgot how to stop burning. Just 1 year apart, the Great Fire of Boston, 1872, and the Great Fire of Chicago, 1871. Sometimes history doesn't whisper, it roars. And in the early 1870s, it did so quite literally as two of America's most prominent cities caught fire. One after the other, like flaming dominoes in a nation still figuring out what urban planning even meant. First came Chicago in 1871. Legend blames Mrs. O'Leary's cow, which allegedly kicked over a lantern in a barn. Whether or not Bessie the arsonist was real doesn't matter. The city burned for days. Flames devoured buildings like matchsticks. Over 17,000 structures gone. A third of the population homeless. Smoke so thick you could see it from Michigan. Then, just a year later in 1872, Boston followed suit. Different city, different context, same result. A firestorm that turned much of the commercial district into rubble. This one was started by a faulty coal stove, but the damage was hauntingly familiar. Dozens of city blocks charred, infrastructure torched, flames licking across rooftops with the same unholy enthusiasm. Here's where the eerie coincidence kicks in. These weren't wooden frontier towns. They were booming hubs, financial centers, beacons of post-Civil War recovery. And yet, both were left vulnerable by the same problem. Poor urban design, narrow streets, wooden construction, understaffed fire departments, and in Boston's case, old-fashioned fire hydrants that didn't match newer hose threads. Imagine trying to save your burning city with a garden hose that doesn't fit the faucet. 2 cities, 2 fires, 1 year apart. And both, in their own flaming way, reshaped American infrastructure. Fire codes got tighter, departments professionalized, cities modernized, if only because they were forced to build from literal ashes. But the smoke didn't just clear. It lingered. It reminded everyone that the American dream, the skyscraper, the marketplace, the city block, was still incredibly flammable. Coincidence or consequence? The fires felt like warnings, not just about fire safety, but about the fragility of progress. All it took was one spark, and the heart of a city became a smoking hole in the ground. And speaking of tragic loss amid power, let's talk about the overlooked grief of two presidents who watched their sons die. Not in war, but within the quiet horror of the White House. Presidential sons dying in office. There's something particularly cruel about losing a child, and even more so when the world is watching. For Abraham Lincoln and Calvin Coolidge, two presidents known for their stoic public images, their sons' deaths weren't just private tragedies. They were national heartbreaks, played out in the same rooms where policy was drafted and history made. Let's begin with Willie Lincoln. The year was 1862. The Civil War was devouring the country, and in the middle of it all, 11-year-old Willie came down with what doctors called bilious fever, likely typhoid, courtesy of contaminated White House water. He died in the residence just a few feet away from his father's war room. Lincoln, the great emancipator, the orator of Gettysburg, collapsed, not politically, emotionally. He reportedly sobbed uncontrollably. His wife, Mary Todd, was inconsolable, and the ghost of Willie lingered. Literally, if you believe the accounts of White House staff who claimed they saw him, heard him, the grief ran so deep it warped the atmosphere. Fast forward to 1924. Calvin Coolidge, America's dry-humored minimalist, was president. His teenage son, Calvin Jr., played tennis on the White House court one summer day. He developed a blister on his foot. That blister got infected. Within a week, he was dead. Septicemia. It's the kind of death that seems impossible in a world of doctors and White House care. And yet, it happened. A boy taken by a shoe. Coolidge never fully recovered. He withdrew emotionally, became quieter, colder. Some historians believe his political ambition died with his son. His presidency turned inward. Efficient, yes, but hollow. What links these stories is more than death. It's timing. Both presidents were in the middle of national crises. Both were symbols of leadership. And both were forced to mourn in the same space they were expected to lead. The coincidence isn't just that they lost sons. It's that they lost them in the White House, a place filled with marble and chandeliers and ghosts, a place where death has its own private hallway. And if you think that kind of fragile contradiction only happens inside the White House, wait until we get to Congress, where legislative solutions once tried to duct tape slavery twice. The Compromise of 1850 and the Missouri Compromise, 1820. American history has a habit of trying to solve bleeding wounds with Band-Aids. And when it came to slavery, the U.S. didn't lack for compromises. It just lacked for actual resolution. Two of the most notable ones, 30 years apart, are eerily similar in structure, failure, and historical whiplash. First came the Missouri Compromise in 1820. Missouri wanted to join the Union as a slave state. Problem was that would tip the balance in the Senate. So Congress did what it does best. It drew a line. Literally, 36 degrees 30 minutes latitude. Above it, no slavery. Below it, fine, enslave away. Missouri joins as a slave state. Maine gets carved out of Massachusetts as a free state. And everyone high-fives themselves for dodging civil war. Except, of course, they hadn't. They'd just postponed it. Fast forward to 1850. The U.S. had gobbled up new territory from the Mexican-American War. The question of slavery spread westward like a virus. Enter the Compromise of 1850. 5 bills, 1 goal: prevent disunion. California comes in as a free state. Utah and New Mexico get popular sovereignty, meaning let the white men vote on whether they'll own other people. And in exchange, the Fugitive Slave Act, so harsh it basically legalized kidnapping. Sound familiar? New land, new rules, same toxic dance. Politicians pretending they'd solve the problem by shifting it west, like sweeping a burning ember under a rug and praying it doesn't ignite the drapes. The coincidences stack up. Both compromises were hailed as solutions. Both included trade-offs designed to keep the Union intact. Both postponed conflict rather than resolving it. And both failed spectacularly, leading directly into the Civil War. They're like sequels to a bad movie. Same characters, slightly different scenery, and an even worse ending. And yet, at the time, they were seen as masterstrokes of moderation. Today, they read like cautionary tales about what happens when you treat human rights as a bargaining chip, about the consequences of trying to engineer peace without addressing the root rot. And speaking of men who refuse to die quietly, let's talk about a former president who took a bullet to the chest and just kept giving his speech. Theodore Roosevelt's near assassination. If Andrew Jackson was rage in human form, Theodore Roosevelt was kinetic energy stuffed into a mustache. The man didn't walk, he charged. And in 1912, during his third-party run under the Bull Moose banner, he proved once and for all that nothing, not even a bullet, could silence his inner narrator. Here's the scene. Milwaukee. Roosevelt steps out to deliver a campaign speech. A man named John Schrank, convinced TR should never win a third term, and possibly receiving direct instructions from the ghost of William McKinley, raises a pistol and fires. Point blank, right to the chest. Here's where reality should pause and allow for horror. But this is Theodore Roosevelt we're talking about. The bullet passes through his metal eyeglass case, through the folded 50-page speech in his coat pocket, and lodges in his chest. Blood seeps through his shirt. Everyone screams. Everyone except Roosevelt. Instead of collapsing or calling for help like a normal human, he calmly announces to the crowd, "It takes more than that to kill a bull moose." Then he proceeds to give the entire 90-minute speech, with the bullet still inside him. Doctors later confirmed that had the bullet not been slowed by his reading material and spectacles, it likely would have pierced his heart. But it didn't. So Roosevelt just kept going, because apparently the laws of biology didn't apply to him. They decided it wasn't worth the argument. He carried the bullet in his body for the rest of his life. No removal, no fuss, just another scar, right next to his war wounds and grisly wrestling trophies. Okay, maybe not the grisly part. Maybe. What's eerie is the symbolism. A man trying to re-enter the presidency, defying party lines, shot in the chest, literally protected by his own words. A walking metaphor for American persistence, or recklessness, or both. Roosevelt didn't win that election, but he left the stage with mythic status, bullet and all. And if you think that's the only haunted seat in American politics, think again. There's a literal chair in the Senate that might be cursed, and it's not even the one closest to Mitch McConnell. The curse of the chair at the Senate. Some people believe in haunted houses, others in haunted objects. But leave it to the U.S. Senate to have a haunted chair. Not metaphorically, not haunted by history or spiritually tainted by bureaucracy, but straight up cursed, if you ask the right Capitol janitor. For decades, one particular chair in the Senate chamber developed a reputation, a quiet one, whispers behind closed doors, late-night remarks from page boys with too much coffee. The story goes, whoever sat in that chair seemed to suffer a streak of tragic or humiliating endings. Heart attacks, scandals, midterm political deaths. Not literal death in every case, but something worse by DC standards, irrelevance. The specifics, hard to verify without a very dedicated Excel spreadsheet. But the pattern became enough of a joke that senators would quietly switch seating assignments or offer to defer their turn. Officially, there is no cursed chair. Unofficially, there absolutely is. What makes this funnier, or creepier, depending on your lean, is how much superstition still exists in a place built on reason and debate. These are people writing legislation, balancing budgets, authorizing war. And yet some of them refuse to sit in a certain place because of bad vibes. It's not unlike the ancient world, where kings wouldn't step through certain thresholds, or where generals watch the flight patterns of birds before battle. Just add marble columns and a sound system that always feeds back during public hearings. Is it just bad luck? Probably. Is it the most Senate thing ever to attribute career implosions to furniture instead of, say, ethics violations or televised gaffes? Absolutely. But even in a place that trades on power and calculation, the human brain still reaches for pattern, for reason, for something, anything, to explain why things keep going wrong in the same chair. Maybe it's cursed. Or maybe it's just that when you cram 100 egos into a single room, something's bound to combust. Still, the idea lingers. A physical object, static, unblinking, collecting failure like dust. And if July 4th is the most patriotic date on the calendar, maybe it's no surprise that it's also one of the most ironically deadly. Let's talk about what happened when Independence Day became an unofficial expiration date. Presidents dying on July 4th again. You already know the headline. Both John Adams and Thomas Jefferson died on July 4th, 1826, the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. But like any recurring horror trope, this one had a sequel. Because 5 years later, on July 4th, 1831, James Monroe, fifth president, founding father, and architect of the Monroe Doctrine, also dropped dead on America's birthday. 3 presidents, 3 signers of the national story, all gone on the 4th of July. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe the Republic needed dramatic timing for its emotional climax. Monroe's death didn't cause quite the same poetic panic that Adams and Jefferson did, mostly because he wasn't part of their little death pact. But it still spooked people. By this point, July 4th had become less of a celebration and more of a presidential Hunger Games. Was it the heat? Unlikely. Was it psychosomatic? The sheer symbolic weight of that day pressing down on old men with too many responsibilities and far too much powdered wig residue? Or, and this is the weird part, was it something stranger? The coincidence feels Shakespearean. As if the Republic were demanding blood in exchange for its birthday cake. Historians ever rational just smile politely and suggest that it's a statistical anomaly, but most of them also admit, off the record, that it's weird. These weren't just any presidents. They were the architects, the philosophical cornerstones, and they all fell on the same day the country lit fireworks in their honor. After Monroe, no other president has died on July 4th. Maybe the spell was broken. Maybe no one wanted to tempt fate anymore. Maybe someone finally started drinking water in summer. But 3 is enough to make a pattern. A trinity. A coincidence so dramatic it feels prescripted. And if you think that's dramatic, wait until we discuss the nation's monuments, where the very architecture of remembrance holds an eerie symmetry of its own. The Lincoln Memorial and the Washington Monument. Washington, D.C. was never meant to be subtle. It's a city that tells its stories in stone, towering symbols, and overly aggressive symmetry. And in the heart of it all are 2 of the most iconic monuments in the country, the Lincoln Memorial and the Washington Monument, perfectly placed, eerily mirrored, and constantly reflecting each other like polite ghosts, trading nods across time. The layout is simple, but loaded with symbolism. You stand at the Lincoln Memorial and look out across the reflecting pool. The image staring back, the Washington Monument rising like a stone needle into the sky, framed by the horizon and duplicated in the water. Turn around and Lincoln himself is sitting, frozen in judgment, forever watching a man he never met, the first president, rise from the ground. That reflecting pool isn't just aesthetic. It's an accidental visual pun. The monuments literally reflect each other. Washington's towering ego, he didn't ask for the obelisk, but it fits, mirrored against Lincoln's seated sorrow, humility carved in marble. A general and a philosopher, a founder and a saver, a sword and a pen. The coincidence isn't just in the reflection, it's in the intention. Both men are remembered as saviors of the nation in different ways. Washington for forming it, Lincoln for preventing it from tearing itself apart. And now, their monuments stare at each other across a body of water, like two chess pieces frozen mid-game. And yet, despite all that planning, both monuments have had their share of strange quirks. The Washington Monument took decades to complete, halted halfway through for nearly 25 years. For a long time, it just stood there, a sad stone stump. The Lincoln Memorial opened during a segregated era, despite honoring the president who signed the Emancipation Proclamation. Contradictions, reflections, irony. It's not just architecture, it's narrative tension. One man birthed the republic, the other bled to keep it alive. And between them, water, silence, memory. But symmetry, as history proves, isn't always peace. Let's look now at two eerily timed economic collapses. Financial fires that burned everything but the paperwork. The Panic of 1837 and the Panic of 1893. America has always had a flair for economic drama. When things go wrong financially, they don't just dip. They plummet, clutching their pearls and dragging millions down with them. Case in point, the Panic of 1837 and the Panic of 1893. Different presidents, different centuries, same gut punch to the national wallet. Let's begin with 1837. Andrew Jackson had just left office, leaving behind a trail of vetoes, bank killing, and unresolved rage. His successor, Martin Van Buren, walked into office and promptly walked into a wall of financial disaster. Speculation had run wild. Credit was too easy. Land prices had inflated like a balloon at a birthday party. And then the pin dropped. Banks collapsed. People lost everything. The phrase hard times tokens became a thing, because even the currency was tired of pretending. The economic downturn lasted for years, with Van Buren's political career permanently stuck in the wreckage. Now fast forward to 1893, a new Gilded Age. Railroads stretching across the continent, industrial power booming, and once again, whoops, speculation crashes the market. This time, it was railroad overbuilding and shaky financing. Banks failed, stock markets panicked, unemployment hit double digits. Soup kitchens became more common than job offers. The similarities are unsettling. Both panics followed periods of intense speculation. Both involved industries growing faster than anyone could regulate. Both triggered massive unemployment and political backlash. And both revealed how fragile the economic engine really was. A rickety thing made of paper promises and blind optimism. The eerie part isn't just the timing, it's the repetition. The United States didn't learn from 1837. It just waited 56 years and did it again, with new toys and worse consequences. Call it an economic Groundhog Day, with more mustaches and fewer regulations. What these two collapses show is that boom and bust cycles are not just economic phenomena, they're cultural. America builds fast, bets big, and then acts shocked when the scaffolding gives way. And if you think those cycles only apply to markets, think again. They show up in marriage records too. Especially when you notice that two presidents married women who shared not just titles, but first names. Presidential wives with the same first name. If you ever find yourself at a trivia night where someone asks, which two first ladies shared the same first name and married presidents from the same family? Congratulations! You're about to become very annoying in the best way. The answer, of course, is Abigail. As in Abigail Adams and Abigail Adams. Let's unpack that, because the coincidence goes deeper than name tags. John Adams, the second president of the United States, was married to Abigail Smith Adams, sharp, opinionated, politically engaged. She was more than a supportive spouse. She was an intellectual equal. In fact, her letters are still studied today for their insight into early American life, politics, and the low-grade misery of 18th century hygiene. Now skip ahead to their son, John Quincy Adams, the sixth president. Like father, like son. And as if to seal the cosmic loop, he also married an Abigail. This time, Abigail Louisa Johnson Adams. Born in England, she was more reserved than her mother-in-law, but no less significant. She was the first foreign-born First Lady, and arguably the first to truly loathe public life in D.C., which, to be fair, hasn't improved much since. Two Adams men, two Abigails. Two dynastic pairs holding the fragile ship of state together with polite smiles and a lot of internalized stress. It's less coincidence and more patriarchal déjà vu. But what makes it truly strange is how uncommon the name Abigail was at the time. Not unheard of, but not wildly trendy. And yet, there it is, recurring at the very top of American power. Like an ancestor reaching back with a monogrammed handkerchief. It's the kind of historical coincidence that feels almost staged. You start to wonder if the founders had a very short baby name list, or if they just liked the idea of keeping things in the family. Name, title, and all. Still, in a world where political dynasties are built on image and narrative, repeating a name is just good branding. It's comforting, familiar, less coincidence, and more legacy with a dash of superstition. And speaking of uncomfortable familiarity, let's talk about two elections where the voters didn't get to decide, and Congress had to roll up its sleeves and pick a president like it was choosing the least problematic cousin at Thanksgiving. The election of 1800 and the election of 1824. If you think today's elections are messy, just wait until you see how America picked a president in its early years. With tie votes, backroom dealing, and the occasional threat of civil collapse. The elections of 1800 and 1824 weren't just controversial. They were chaotic, and eerily similar in how they exposed the structural weaknesses of the new republic. Sort of like putting a toddler in charge of a nuclear submarine. Start with 1800, Thomas Jefferson versus John Adams. A brutal campaign full of slander, religion baiting, and enough passive aggression to kill a moose. But the real disaster came in the Electoral College. Jefferson and his running mate, Aaron Burr, received the same number of electoral votes, a glitch caused by a system where electors didn't specify which candidate they were voting for as president and which as vice president. So it went to the House of Representatives. And then, it sat there for 36 ballots. 36. That's not an election. That's a hostage situation. It was only after Alexander Hamilton, yes, that Hamilton, swung support to Jefferson that the tie was broken. Burr snubbed, brooded for a few years, then famously shot Hamilton in a duel. Because that's how politics used to work, apparently. Now fast forward to 1824. Four major candidates ran. Andrew Jackson, John Quincy Adams, William Crawford, and Henry Clay. Jackson won the popular vote and had the most electoral votes, but not a majority. Once again, the election went to the House. This time, the backroom deal was less dramatic, but equally shady. Clay, who came in fourth and was eliminated, threw his support behind Adams. Adams won. And then, surprise, Clay became Secretary of State. Jackson's supporters called it the corrupt bargain, and the label stuck like political gum on a boot heel. So we have two elections, 24 years apart, where the winner wasn't chosen by the people, but by a handful of congressmen in smoky rooms. The eerie part? Both resulted in bitter rivals gaining power, parties splitting apart, and long-term shifts in how Americans viewed democracy. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe it's just the natural consequence of building a political system before inventing quality control. And speaking of massive, transformative national projects that changed everything, let's talk about two canals centuries apart that rewrote the map of American ambition: the Erie Canal and the Panama Canal. At first glance, the Erie Canal and the Panama Canal might seem like distant cousins in infrastructure. Both wet, both long, both the kind of thing you pretend to care about during history class. But dig deeper, and the coincidence becomes clear. Two engineering feats, nearly a century apart, each transformed the U.S. economy and global trade in eerily similar ways. Start with the Erie Canal, completed in 1825. Before it existed, shipping goods between the Midwest and the East Coast was about as efficient as mailing a piano. Then suddenly, bam! 363 miles of man-made waterway connecting Lake Erie to the Hudson River. The price of shipping goods dropped by 95%. Cities like Buffalo and Rochester exploded overnight. New York became the commercial capital of the U.S., and it was all done with shovels, mules, and what must have been the collective lower back pain of an entire generation. Now leap ahead to the early 20th century. The Panama Canal, completed in 1914, carved a watery shortcut through the narrow spine of Central America. Before that, ships had to go all the way around Cape Horn, an oceanic death gauntlet that made everyone seasick and most captains questioned their life choices. Panama shortened the trip from New York to San Francisco by 8,000 miles. That's not a shortcut. That's a magic trick. Trade exploded, naval power shifted. The U.S. firmly planted itself as a Pacific and Atlantic power. And once again, the economy went into overdrive. The coincidences go further. Both projects were massive bets on the future. Both were ridiculed before they were built. Both faced immense engineering challenges, swamps, disease, political chaos, and both, in hindsight, seem obvious. Of course, we needed those canals. Of course, they changed everything. But at the time, they were dreams duct-taped to maps. They also share something darker. Both came at high human cost. Laborers died in droves. Conditions were brutal. The glory of the project came stamped with mud and blood. And if you think presidential security has improved in the centuries since, let's revisit two assassinations that, despite being decades apart, were carried out by men with the same motive: bitter disappointment. The assassination of James Garfield and the assassination of William McKinley. American presidents, for all their pomp and protection, have historically been very stabbable, shootable, or otherwise unlucky in crowds. And while Lincoln and Kennedy get most of the cinematic treatment, James Garfield and William McKinley share a disturbing pattern that rarely gets the spotlight. Both were assassinated by delusional men who thought the presidency owed them something. Let's start with Garfield. In 1881, Charles J. Guiteau, failed lawyer, failed evangelist, failed everything, believed he deserved a government appointment because he wrote a mildly supportive pamphlet during Garfield's campaign. Garfield ignored him. Guiteau responded by shooting the president in a D.C. train station, not out of hatred, out of entitlement. His literal explanation was, "I am a stalwart, and Arthur is president now." As if killing someone was a form of job negotiation. Garfield didn't die immediately. He lingered for months, not because the bullet was fatal, but because his doctors repeatedly poked around in the wound with unwashed hands. The bullet wasn't the problem. The medicine was. He eventually succumbed to infection, becoming a martyr to both ignorance and ego. Now let's talk McKinley. In 1901, he was at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York, a world's fair designed to show off American progress. Enter Leon Czolgosz, a self-declared anarchist who became obsessed with the idea that the president was a corrupt tool of capitalism. He approached McKinley in a receiving line, shook his hand with one, and shot him with a concealed gun in the other. Like Garfield, McKinley didn't die immediately. He held on for 8 days. His doctors thought he was recovering. until infection spread, and down he went. 2 presidents, 2 assassins, 2 grotesque mirrors of unfulfilled dreams turned violent, and both times the aftermath reshaped the country. Garfield's death led to civil service reform. McKinley's gave us Theodore Roosevelt, the bulletproof speech giver from earlier. What links these events is the grotesque similarity in motive, disappointment, delusion, and a sense of grievance. Not political ideology, not grand conspiracy. Just 2 unstable men who thought history owed them something. And next, we'll meet 2 presidents who shared bloodlines and ambitions, even if they rarely shared dinner. Theodore Roosevelt and Franklin D. Roosevelt's cousin connection. It's easy to forget, in the haze of national myth-making, that history sometimes repeats itself not because of fate, but because of family. Enter the Roosevelts, Theodore and Franklin. 2 presidents, 2 distinct legacies. And, as every trivia nerd will gladly remind you, 5th cousins. Which means somewhere in their shared DNA, ambition was hard-coded next to mustache wax and public policy obsession. Start with Theodore, our rough-riding, trust-busting, speech-surviving force of nature. The guy made conservation cool and imperialism sound like a camping trip. He was the American-eyed in a 3-piece suit. Explosive, larger than life, and perpetually posing for a statue that hadn't been built yet. Now contrast that with Franklin. Suave, controlled, eloquent, and permanently seated. FDR contracted polio in 1921, but instead of retiring to obscurity, he reinvented what power looked like. 4 terms, a New Deal, a war. He didn't just lead, he endured. Where Teddy roared, Franklin whispered the nation through the Depression. And yet, the familial parallels are uncanny. Both came from elite New York families. Both married into the same family. FDR's wife, Eleanor, was Theodore's niece. Yes, his niece. Both reshaped the presidency, expanded executive power, and carved their faces into the psychological Mount Rushmore of American leadership. The coincidence isn't just their relation, it's the timing. Theodore's rise in the early 1900s set the stage for the modern presidency. Direct, media-savvy, unafraid to punch monopolies in the face. Franklin's ascent, 2 decades later, took those same tools and used them to hold the country together through economic collapse and global war. And yes, they were stylistically opposite. Teddy hunted lions. FDR bred programs. But under the surface, they shared a belief in strong leadership and the federal government as a force for progress, or at the very least a tool to keep everything from going completely off the rails. Bloodline? Maybe. But more than that, ideology passed like a torch between generations. One Roosevelt kicked the door open. The other reinforced it and installed central heating. And while we're on the subject of mass movements and internal transformation, let's follow the trail of dust and desperation. From one wave of migration to another, both rewriting the human geography of America. The Great Migration and the Dust Bowl Migration. America is a country shaped by movement, not just metaphorically, physically. Trains, wagons, buses, boots on dirt roads. A restless mass of people pushing forward, usually away from disaster and toward a dream that might not exist. And few movements define that restlessness like the Great Migration and the Dust Bowl Exodus. 2 giant shuffles of humanity, each triggered by catastrophe, each rewriting America's demographic DNA. Start with the Great Migration. Between 1916 and 1970, over 6 million African Americans left the South for cities in the North, Midwest, and West. They were fleeing Jim Crow laws, lynch mobs, and the ghosts of slavery that refused to die. They arrived in Chicago, Detroit, Philadelphia, Los Angeles, looking for work, dignity, and less chance of being murdered for existing. The migration reshaped everything. Labor markets, urban culture, politics. It birthed jazz clubs in Harlem and civil rights marches in Washington. But it also brought new tensions. Racism didn't evaporate. It just put on a new suit and moved north. Now pivot to the Dust Bowl. In the 1930s, the Great Plains dried up and blew away. Overfarmed soil turned into clouds of choking dirt. Entire families in Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas, and Arkansas packed their belongings and headed west, most famously to California. Okies, they were called, often with a sneer. They didn't face segregation, but they did face suspicion. Migrant camps, exploited labor, local resentment. They came seeking Eden and found agribusiness and tents. Grapes of Wrath wasn't fiction. It was journalism with a plot twist. Here's the eerie parallel. Both migrations involved millions of Americans displaced by systems they couldn't control. One by racism, one by environmental collapse and economic ruin. Both involved people replanning their lives in places that didn't want them. Both left scars still visible in housing, voting, and class structures today. Coincidence? Perhaps. But more likely, it's a pattern. When things fall apart in America, people move. Not because it fixes everything, but because hope always seems to be somewhere else. And speaking of people refusing to stay put, let's revisit two early rebellions that tested just how far Americans would go to avoid paying taxes, and how close we came to eating our own Constitution. The Whiskey Rebellion and Shays Rebellion. There's something deeply American about rebellion. It's practically in the job description. But what happens when the revolutionaries win and then get rebelled against? Enter Shays Rebellion and the Whiskey Rebellion. Two uprisings that feel like mirror images, separated by a handful of years and a major constitutional rewrite. Let's start with Shays. The year is 1786. The American Revolution is over. But the bills are piling up. Farmers in Massachusetts, and many of them veterans who hadn't been paid, are being thrown into debtor's prison. Taxes are up. Mortgages are overdue. Enter Daniel Shays, a former captain in the Continental Army, who leads an armed group to shut down courts and block foreclosures. The rebellion fails, but the message is clear. The Articles of Confederation, America's original blueprint, are a mess. There's no strong federal government, no real power to intervene. The whole thing is a wet paper bag trying to carry a cannonball. Shays' rebellion scares the elite enough to kickstart the Constitutional Convention. Now fast forward a decade. The Constitution is in place. Washington is president. The federal government is flexing its muscles. And in western Pennsylvania, farmers are angry again. This time, over a federal tax on whiskey. Whiskey was their currency, their trade, their entire economy in liquid form. They rise up, refuse to pay, burn tax collector homes, raise militias. Washington responds by sending 13,000 troops, more soldiers than he commanded in most battles of the Revolution, to stomp it out. Here's where it gets twisted. Both rebellions involved farmers. Both were about taxes. But in one, the rebels were called patriots. In the other, they were traitors. The difference: who held the pen? The eerie coincidence is not just the surface similarities, it's the deeper pattern. That the very same people who overthrew a monarchy for taxing them too much would immediately begin taxing each other. And that the nation, barely born, had to decide whether rebellion was still heroic or just inconvenient. And if you think rebellion only shows up in musket fire and courtrooms, wait until we hit the gold mines and oil rigs, where the real American religion begins, striking it rich. The gold rush and the oil booms. If you want to understand America's real love language, skip the Constitution and head straight to the nearest hole in the ground. Because from the very beginning, this country has been infatuated with digging things up and selling them. Two of the most seismic moments in that dirt-covered romance, the gold rush of the mid-19th century and the oil booms of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Start with gold. In 1848, at Sutter's Mill in California, someone found a glinting rock in the water. And within months, the entire country was foaming at the mouth. By 1849, hundreds of thousands of people, the infamous 49ers, were trekking across deserts, mountains, and oceans to get their hands on shiny rocks. Cities exploded from dust. San Francisco, once a sleepy port town, became a manic, gold-fueled metropolis overnight. It wasn't just a migration. It was a mania. And like all manias, it came with consequences. Displacement of native populations, environmental devastation, makeshift laws, broken dreams. Few got rich. Most got debt, disease, or dysentery. But the dream, the belief that riches could be pulled from dirt, never died. Now, leap to Pennsylvania in 1859. Edwin Drake strikes oil, and suddenly the U.S. has a new obsession: black gold, liquid wealth. The same story plays out. Boomtowns spring up overnight. Fortunes are made and lost faster than you can say speculative bubble. Then Texas joins the party, and suddenly you're not just striking it rich. You're shaping geopolitics with a drill. The eerie similarity, both the gold rush and the oil booms weren't just economic events. They were psychological viruses. They taught Americans that the next big thing could be hiding beneath your feet. That wealth wasn't earned slowly. It was extracted, ripped from the land. Instant success, at a price no one bothers to calculate until the dust settles. They created new classes of elites, new forms of corruption, and a distinctly American flavor of optimism. Delusional, stubborn, and heavily armed. And if you think that belief in past wounds can't be weaponized, let's talk about how the Civil War kept showing up in politics. Long after the shooting stopped. The bloody shirt in politics. There's petty political mudslinging, and then there's waving the literal blood-soaked shirt of a dead Union soldier in front of your opponent and saying, "Vote for me," or you're basically siding with treason. Welcome to post-Civil War American politics, where the ghosts didn't just haunt, they campaigned. The phrase "waving the bloody shirt" emerged as a shorthand for Republicans invoking the Civil War to discredit Democrats. It wasn't subtle. During elections, Republican candidates would hammer home the idea that they had won the war, preserved the Union, freed the slaves, and that Democrats were the party of rebellion, disloyalty, and secret sympathy for the Confederacy. In other words, do you really want to vote for the people who tried to destroy the country? Remember Antietam? And it worked. For decades. The strange part is how effective this tactic remained, even as new generations of voters entered the scene. Candidates who were children during the war still leaned on the rhetoric. Voters who'd never seen battle were still emotionally swayed. It became political currency, not just to honor the dead, but to weaponize them. The eerie part? The Democrats eventually tried to mirror the move, invoking Reconstruction abuses, portraying Republicans as corrupt occupiers and tyrants. The Civil War wasn't just a memory, it was a tool, a re-election strategy. Even as late as the 1880s and 1890s, the bloody shirt made appearances in stump speeches, newspaper cartoons, and campaign posters. It was history's version of a guilt trip, broadcast on repeat. This wasn't about memory. It was about power. About how the pain of a nation could be kept simmering just below boiling point for political gain. The phrase eventually faded, but the method never died. Today, we call it playing the bass, or identity politics, or dog whistle messaging. But the core strategy? Same as ever. Keep the wound open. Point to it during debates and whisper, "This is what happens when you vote for them." And if you think corruption was limited to rhetoric, just wait until we hit two presidencies whose scandals were less about ideology and more about good old-fashioned grift. The presidencies of Ulysses S. Grant and Warren G. Harding. Being president is hard. But watching your entire administration unravel in a web of corruption and grifting cronies, that's a level of humiliation only a few have truly mastered. And at the top of that sad little leaderboard are Ulysses S. Grant and Warren G. Harding. Start with Grant. The man was a war hero, a Civil War juggernaut whose military victories crushed the Confederacy. So naturally, when he entered the White House in 1869, everyone expected him to bring the same discipline to government. Instead, his presidency quickly turned into a group project where everyone cheated and no one studied. Grant himself wasn't corrupt. He was just loyal. Dangerously loyal. He handed out positions like party favors, often to friends, relatives, and former officers. The result? A parade of scandals. The whiskey ring, where government agents embezzled millions in tax revenue. The credit mobilier affair, involving railroad fraud and bribery. And more shady land deals than a 3 a.m. infomercial. Now fast forward to Harding, elected in 1920 on a platform of normalcy, which apparently included rampant backroom deals, bootleg liquor, and the Teapot Dome scandal. That last one involved oil leases, bribery, and a literal metaphor of corruption bubbling from beneath the ground. Harding's friends, dubbed the Ohio Gang, were basically a crime syndicate in tailored suits. Like Grant, Harding wasn't the mastermind. He was more like the guy asleep at the wheel while his buddies looted the car. The eerie coincidence isn't just the scandals. It's how both men were remembered, beloved during their lives, revered by many, then slowly, painfully, their reputations curdled. Grant's required historical rehabilitation, his military genius eventually outshining his political naivete. Harding? Not so lucky. His name still triggers eye rolls and snarky footnotes. Both presidencies serve as reminders that corruption doesn't need villains in capes. Sometimes it just needs one guy in the big chair who doesn't ask too many questions. And speaking of massive national projects that required vision, concrete, and questionable motivations, let's shift gears to two infrastructure miracles that reshaped the map and the American psyche: the first transcontinental railroad and the interstate highway system. Some countries dream with poetry. America dreams with concrete. From the golden spike driven into the Utah desert to the endless ribbons of asphalt slicing across 50 states, two infrastructure projects define not only how Americans move, but how they think: the transcontinental railroad and the interstate highway system. 2 centuries, 2 revolutions, same ambition: to bind a sprawling, often incoherent country together by sheer will and steel. First, the Transcontinental Railroad. Completed in 1869, it connected the Atlantic and Pacific coasts for the first time by rail. Before it, a cross-country trip meant months of wagons, cholera, and an excellent chance of dying somewhere in Nebraska. With the railroad, it took a week. A week. The country didn't just shrink, it snapped into place. Towns popped up overnight. Trade exploded. Indigenous lands were devoured. It was a miracle. It was a nightmare. It was manifest destiny with a coal engine. Now fast forward to 1956. Dwight D. Eisenhower, fresh off the Second World War and thoroughly impressed by Germany's Autobahns, signed the Federal Aid Highway Act. The goal? A 41,000-mile network of interstate highways. The Cold War justification was that tanks and missiles could travel quickly in the event of invasion. But what it really enabled was the birth of suburbia, fast food, car culture, and the general American belief that a 9-hour drive is a reasonable day trip. Just like the railroad, the interstate system rewired the economy. Towns bypassed by highways withered. Cities sprawled. The rhythm of daily life, commutes, vacations, logistics, changed forever. And just like the railroad, it came at a cost. Communities destroyed, especially black neighborhoods cleaved in half by new routes. It's a recurring theme. Progress delivered with a wrecking ball. The eerie parallel is in how each project promised unity and delivered transformation. Both were massive federal undertakings. Both were sold as necessities. And both redefined the meaning of distance and destiny in America. But if you think large-scale engineering can't mess with the psyche, Just wait until we visit two moral panics that burned innocent people at the stake. Metaphorically once, literally the other. The Salem witch trials and McCarthyism. One was a Puritan nightmare soaked in superstition. The other was a Cold War fever dream drenched in ideology. But the Salem witch trials of 1692 and Senator Joseph McCarthy's Red Scare in the 1950s are twisted reflections of the same American impulse: panic, persecution, and the relentless search for enemies within. Let's start in Salem. A few bored girls, a town drenched in religious paranoia, and a long winter turned into a full-on moral collapse. Accusations of witchcraft flew faster than common sense. Spectral evidence, dreams, visions, gut feelings, became admissible in court. Over 200 people were accused. 19 were hanged. One was crushed to death under rocks for refusing to confess. It was equal parts tragedy and absurdity, like a Stephen King novel rewritten by a Puritan insurance clerk. Now fast forward to the 1950s. America is high on victory from World War II and already spiraling into nuclear anxiety. Enter Joseph McCarthy, a senator from Wisconsin with a fondness for waving papers in the air and shouting about communists. He claimed to have lists, hundreds of names, subversives in government, in Hollywood, in the military. Anyone who dared question him became suspect. Careers ended. Families broke apart. Fear ruled. Sound familiar? In both cases, the accused were often guilty of little more than being odd, outspoken, or unlucky. Both movements fed on hysteria. Both were driven by power-hungry figures who exploited fear for personal gain. And both eventually collapsed under the weight of their own absurdity, though not before ruining lives. The coincidence isn't just structural, it's emotional. Salem and McCarthyism both hinged on the idea that purity must be defended at all costs. That doubt equals guilt. That silence is dangerous. The mechanisms were different, but the moral panic was the same. Burn the witches, blacklist the Reds. And the most American part? After it was over, everyone just kind of moved on. No national therapy, no reckoning, just an uncomfortable silence, and a few years later, a Netflix docuseries. But not every president left a legacy of fear. Some tried to leave behind cleaner air, and surprisingly, they weren't the ones you'd expect. Theodore Roosevelt's conservation efforts and Richard Nixon's EPA creation. When you picture environmentalism, you probably don't imagine Teddy Roosevelt, a man who shot a bear and then felt bad enough to invent the teddy bear. Nor do you think of Richard Nixon, a man whose idea of camouflage was a resignation speech. And yet, oddly enough, both presidents left massive green footprints on American policy. One carved wilderness into law. The other created the bureaucratic machinery to protect it. Start with Roosevelt, a rough-riding, tree-hugging contradiction. He loved hunting, but he also loved not wiping every species off the map. Under his presidency, over 230 million acres of land were set aside as national parks, forests, and monuments. He created the U.S. Forest Service and gave teeth to the idea that nature wasn't just something to conquer, it was something to preserve. To Teddy, conservation wasn't about being gentle, it was about legacy. He saw the frontier vanishing and decided, nope, not on my watch. So he strong-armed Congress, signed executive orders, and turned environmental protection into a moral crusade. Now flip to Nixon. Tricky Dick. Not exactly the face of the Sierra Club. But in 1970, amid rising public concern about pollution, Nixon signed the National Environmental Policy Act, established the Environmental Protection Agency, and signed into law the Clean Air Act. Why? Was he secretly an eco-warrior? Probably not. But he saw the political momentum and, like any good strategist, rode it. Nixon's EPA would go on to regulate industry, improve air and water quality, and lay the groundwork for environmental law in the U.S. Not bad for a guy more associated with wiretaps than water purity. Here's the strange overlap. Both men came from different eras, different parties, and vastly different reputations. But each, in his own way, helped shape how the U.S. protects its environment. And neither fits the modern image of an environmentalist, which honestly makes their achievements even more compelling. Sometimes it's not the greenest-sounding people who do the greenest things. And if the air is a little cleaner and the forests a little taller, it's because two deeply flawed men decided, for once, to preserve instead of consume. And speaking of consuming, next we hit two economic meltdowns that show how fragile that dream of prosperity really is. The Panic of 1907 and the stock market crash of 1929. Economic disasters don't announce themselves with trumpet fanfare. They show up with whispers, bank runs, and newspaper headlines that get more panicked with each edition. And in America's case, two crashes, one in 1907, the other in 1929, didn't just shake the market. They exposed how rickety the scaffolding of American finance really was, and how easily one gust of fear could send the whole system toppling like a house of leverage cards. Start with 1907. It wasn't technically a depression, but it was close. Triggered by failed speculation in copper, the crisis snowballed as banks began collapsing and trust companies found themselves, well, untrusted. The stock market plummeted. Depositors yanked their money out of banks faster than the clerks could count. Panic spread like mold in a damp basement. Enter J.P. Morgan, not the bank, the man. He gathered a group of financiers in a room, locked the doors, and told them, basically, "You're saving the economy whether you like it or not." He poured millions of his own money into stabilizing the markets, underwriting failing banks like some top-hatted messiah of capitalism. The government mostly just watched and clapped. The aftershock of 1907 helped push the creation of the Federal Reserve. Because apparently depending on one wealthy banker to stop financial collapse was not a sustainable plan. Then, 1929. This one you already know, or at least you know the imagery. Ticker tape raining like confetti, Wall Street bankers diving out of windows, mostly a myth, but still a compelling visual. The Roaring Twenties grinding to a screeching halt as over-leveraged stock prices collapsed in October. Millions lost their savings. Banks failed en masse. Unemployment soared. The Great Depression began, and wouldn't end for a decade and a world war. The similarities? Both crises were fueled by speculation, loose regulation, and blind optimism. Both started with a few bad moves and spiraled into national crises, and both showed how fragile trust is. Once it's gone, no law or speech can replace it fast enough. The coincidence isn't just that these collapses happened, it's that the exact same psychology drove both. Greed, followed by fear, followed by ruin. And if you think that kind of cycle only affects markets, let's talk about debates. Two of them, staged a century apart, that changed not just elections, but the art of political performance itself. The Lincoln-Douglas debates and the Kennedy-Nixon debates. Debates are supposed to be about ideas, about arguments, about substance. But more often than not, they're about who sweats more, who looks taller, and who can deliver a zinger without blinking. And nowhere is this clearer than in the uncanny parallels between the Lincoln-Douglas debates of 1858 and the Kennedy-Nixon debates of 1960. Two showdowns that weren't just rhetorical battles, but pivotal moments in how Americans see their leaders. First, 1858. Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas were both vying for a U.S. Senate seat in Illinois. They held 7 debates across the state, attracting massive crowds. Not because of stagecraft, but because this was how political arguments happened before cable news. The main issue? Slavery, expansion, the soul of the Union. And Lincoln, then relatively unknown outside Illinois, rose to national prominence by turning moral clarity into a campaign strategy. Douglas won the Senate race, But Lincoln won the long game. His performance in those debates positioned him as a serious national figure, someone who could challenge the existing order with reason, wit, and a commanding presence. Now jump to 1960. John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon face off in the first ever televised presidential debates. On radio, most listeners said Nixon won. But on television, Kennedy looked better. He was calm, tan, and camera-ready. Nixon, recently hospitalized and refusing makeup, looked like a sweaty ghost who hadn't eaten in 3 days. The substance of their debate mattered. Cold War tensions, civil rights, economic policy. But the visuals mattered more. Kennedy understood the new medium. Nixon didn't. And that moment changed campaigns forever. Image was now inseparable from message. The parallel. Both debates launched one man into higher office, not by winning the actual contest, but by dominating the narrative. Lincoln lost, but became a national figure. Kennedy looked better and felt more presidential. Both moments also redefined their mediums. Lincoln and Douglas set the standard for public discourse in the 19th century. Kennedy and Nixon did the same for the television age. The eerie coincidence is how the rules changed each time, and how those who adapted, not necessarily those who argued best, ended up shaping history. And if you're not already questioning what counts as a victory, let's examine 2 quick wars that changed global power, fast, violently, and permanently. The Spanish-American War and the Gulf War. America doesn't always do long wars. Sometimes it prefers its conflicts short, sharp, and strategically lucrative. Enter 2 nearly century-apart clashes, the Spanish-American War in 1898 and the Gulf War in 1991. Different continents, different enemies, same eerie script, overwhelming U.S. firepower, brief military engagement, and a sudden reshuffling of global power. First up, Spain. By 1898, its empire was a crumbling relic. Cuba was rebelling. The USS Maine exploded in Havana Harbor under mysterious circumstances, and Remember the Maine became the 19th century version of a trending hashtag. Public outrage, fanned by yellow journalism, pushed the U.S. into war. The whole thing lasted about 10 weeks. The U.S. Navy crushed Spanish forces in both the Caribbean and the Philippines. America walked away with new territories, Puerto Rico, Guam, and a brand new imperial foothold in the Pacific. The U.S. was no longer just a country. It was an empire. Now skip to 1991. Iraq invades Kuwait. George H.W. Bush launches Operation Desert Storm, backed by an international coalition. U.S. forces obliterate Saddam Hussein's army in 6 weeks. Minimal American casualties. Maximum display of military dominance. Both wars were televised. The Spanish-American War through breathless newspaper reports and illustrations. The Gulf War through live CNN footage and glowing night vision bombs. Both were sold to the public as moral crusades. Liberation, justice, protecting the innocent. And both catapulted presidents into short-lived popularity spikes. But underneath the surface, each war marked a pivot. 1898 launched the U.S. into global imperialism. 1991 confirmed it as the sole superpower of the post-Cold War world. They weren't just battles. They were announcements. And the eerie part? Both came with unintended consequences. The Philippines didn't welcome U.S. liberation so much as resent it, didn't magically democratize after defeat. The seeds planted in these short wars often grew into long entanglements. Victory, as always, is a tricky thing to measure, especially when the war is over, but the fallout is just beginning. And speaking of fallout, let's step into 1968, a year that saw 2 of the brightest lights of hope extinguished in the same tragic season. The assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy. 1968 was the year the American dream bled out in public. Twice, in 2 gut punches that landed just weeks apart, the nation lost Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Senator Robert F. Kennedy, the preacher and the politician, the voice and the vessel. And while their deaths were not connected by a gunman or a motive, the proximity of their assassinations makes them feel like two verses in the same tragic song. Start with King. April 4th, 1968. Memphis. He was there to support striking sanitation workers. He gave a speech the night before. "I've been to the mountaintop," that now reads like a man eulogizing himself in real time. He spoke of longevity not mattering, of seeing the promised land, of not fearing any man. The next day, a sniper's bullet struck him on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel. He was 39. The country erupted. Riots in more than 100 cities. Grief turned to fire. Hope curdled into rage. King's death didn't just end a life. It vacuumed the oxygen out of the civil rights movement at a moment when momentum was still fragile. Then came Kennedy. June 5th, 1968. Los Angeles. He'd just won the California primary in his run for the Democratic nomination. He was delivering a victory speech. He walked through the kitchen of the Ambassador Hotel and was shot by Sirhan Sirhan, a young man with a grudge and a revolver. RFK died the next day. He had been running as the anti-war candidate, the candidate of the poor, the one promising to bring King's legacy forward, not just memorialize it. His death felt like the sequel no one wanted, the final nail in a coffin that had already been lowered. The coincidence isn't that two men were killed. It's that they were killed then, together, before they were done. Their visions of racial justice, economic equity, peace, were inconvenient, disruptive, and maybe to the wrong people, intolerable. 1968 was supposed to be a year of turning points. Instead, it became a year of ghosts, and America never quite recovered its voice. Speaking of ghosts and things we thought were safely preserved, let's talk about the strange double tragedies of America's most sacred libraries going up in flames. The burning of Washington, D.C., 1814, and the fire at the Library of Congress, 1851. You would think the seat of American government would have better fireproofing. But twice, once in war, once by accident, the intellectual soul of the nation went up in smoke. And the eerie part? Both times the flames devoured more than just books. They burned memory, ambition, and the fragile illusion that civilization is something you can shelve alphabetically. Start with 1814. The War of 1812 was dragging on like a bad sequel. British troops, furious after the U.S. burned down Canada's parliament, marched into Washington, D.C., and set fire to nearly everything. The Capitol, the Treasury, and yes, the Library of Congress. They torched the books, torched the desks, torched the chairs for good measure. It wasn't just destruction, it was erasure. Enter Thomas Jefferson, who famously sold his personal library, nearly 6,500 books, to Congress as a replacement. That's right, the guy who loved Enlightenment, ideals, and contradictions, see slavery, became the post-apocalyptic librarian-in-chief. His collection formed the nucleus of the new Library of Congress. Problem solved? Not quite. In 1851, a stove malfunction caused yet another fire in the Library of Congress, this time a peacetime blaze. No redcoats needed. 2/3 of Jefferson's collection burned to ash. Rare volumes. Enlightenment treatises. Gone. Again. The coincidence isn't just that the same institution burned twice. It's what was lost, and when. In 1814, it was knowledge destroyed by an enemy. In 1851, it was knowledge undone by our own negligence. External threat versus internal oversight. Sword versus stove. Both fires served as reminders that America's story isn't just written in law. It's archived in ink and parchment. And those things, as it turns out, are terrifyingly flammable. We rebuilt each time, of course. Bigger, better, with more fire-resistant shelving. But something was always lost. Not just documents, but the sense that progress is permanent. And if that sounds like a stretch, wait until you hear how two struggling colonies, founded over a decade apart, both nearly collapsed before becoming national origin stories. Spoiler. It involves death, starvation, and a lot of terrible decisions. The founding of Jamestown and the founding of Plymouth. Jamestown and Plymouth. Two names etched into every elementary school history book, every Thanksgiving placemat, every myth about rugged individualism and new beginnings. But the coincidence isn't just that they were both English colonies. It's that they both nearly died before they lived, and somehow still became origin stories. First, Jamestown. Founded in 1607, it was the first permanent English settlement in North America. It was also an unmitigated disaster. The men who arrived had no idea how to survive. They were gentlemen, not farmers. The local Powhatan Confederacy was understandably skeptical. Disease ran wild, food was scarce, and during the starving time of 1609 to 1610, settlers reportedly resorted to cannibalism. And yet somehow Jamestown endured. Why? Tobacco, cash crop, economic addiction. Now Plymouth, founded in 1620 by a group of Puritan separatists, better known as the Pilgrims. They arrived on the Mayflower, armed with God and a few dubious navigation skills. Winter slaughtered them. Nearly half died in the first year. They were saved, temporarily, by an uneasy alliance with local Wampanoag tribes. And yes, they did have a harvest feast, but it wasn't exactly a Hallmark special. The coincidence here is in the rhythm. Both colonies were acts of desperation. Both endured brutal first years. Both succeeded only after adjusting their expectations, compromising with native tribes, and discovering a product to export. And both became deeply mythologized, scrubbed clean of their initial horror, and repackaged as tales of freedom, faith, and destiny. Jamestown gets remembered for capitalism, Plymouth for religious freedom. But both were driven by escape, one from poverty, one from persecution. Neither were prepared for what they found. It's almost as if America's founding DNA requires suffering first, success later, and historical revisionism somewhere in between. And if you think that founding spirit can't come back in strange new forms, just wait until you see what happens when a 19th century populist and a 21st century reality TV star both take the same wrecking ball to the political establishment. The presidency of Andrew Jackson and the presidency of Donald Trump. Andrew Jackson and Donald Trump. Two men separated by nearly 2 centuries, yet somehow playing the same political character in different costumes. Jackson wore military regalia and glared at portraits. Trump wore red ties and glared at Twitter. But the vibe, the energy, practically identical. A populist middle finger to the establishment shouted from opposite ends of American history. Let's start with Jackson, the 7th president, Old Hickory, a war hero who styled himself as the champion of the common man, which in 1830 mostly meant white men who hated banks. He loathed elites, hated centralized financial power, declared war on the Second Bank of the United States like it owed him money personally. When the Supreme Court made a decision he didn't like, he allegedly said, "John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it." Translation, try me. Jackson turned the presidency into a blunt force political instrument. He was rage and charisma wrapped in frontier dirt and institutional distrust. His critics called him a tyrant. His fans, a movement. Now Trump, a real estate mogul turned reality TV star turned president. He also ran against the elites, political, cultural, coastal, claimed to represent the forgotten man despite living in a golden penthouse. Trump distrusted bureaucracies, defied judicial norms, and treated federal agencies like personal accessories. He didn't quote the Constitution, he quote tweeted it. Both men entered office as outsiders promising to drain swamps. Jackson, metaphorically, Trump, literally, or so he said. Both were adored by supporters and loathed by detractors. Both bulldozed norms with the glee of a toddler with a plastic hammer. The eerie coincidence isn't just in their policies or their populist flair. It's in the national reaction, the way each man polarized the country, redefined political communication, and left institutions scrambling to adapt. Jackson gave us the spoils system. Trump gave us the social media presidency. History doesn't repeat itself, but it does seem to keep a wardrobe of familiar costumes. And sometimes, it pulls out Andrew Jackson's tailored defiance and lets someone new try it on. And while Jackson may have swung the axe of populism, another invention, far more mechanical and subtle, quietly rewired American labor forever. The development of the cotton gin and the automation of factories. There are inventions that make life easier. And then there are inventions that explode history. The cotton gin and factory automation belong to the second category. Two moments of mechanical progress that didn't just change the economy. They changed who worked, how, and under what illusions of control. Let's start with the cotton gin. Invented by Eli Whitney in 1793, it was supposed to make processing cotton faster. Spoiler, it did. It mechanized the tedious task of separating cotton fibers from seeds, something that previously took hours of human labor. The result? Cotton production exploded. Sounds good, right? Wrong. Instead of reducing labor, the gin increased the demand for slavery. With cotton suddenly more profitable, Southern plantations doubled down on human bondage. By 1860, cotton was king, and slavery its unholy crown. The cotton gin didn't end toil, it scaled it. Mechanization, paradoxically, made the human cost worse. Now leap ahead 2 centuries to factory automation. The industrial robots, conveyor belts, and algorithmic scheduling that transformed 20th and 21st century production. Like the gin, these systems promised efficiency, fewer mistakes, faster output, lower costs. But just like the cotton gin, the human cost was complicated. Jobs vanished, skills became obsolete, entire industries hollowed out. Workers were replaced, not just physically, but conceptually. Human labor was no longer the default. It was a fallback, the eerie parallel. Both inventions sold the illusion of liberation, and both delivered a very specific kind of entrapment. The cotton gin entrenched slavery, even as it appeared to reduce work. Automation disrupted livelihoods while promising productivity. And in both cases, the benefits flowed upward, to plantation owners, to CEOs, to shareholders. The machines didn't just change how things were made. They restructured who held power over making them. So when people talk about technological revolutions, it's worth asking, a revolution for whom? Because in America, the machinery may evolve, but the logic, profit over people, seems to stay well-oiled. And speaking of expansion and cold, hard deals, let's talk about 2 land purchases that doubled the size of the nation and raised just as many eyebrows as they did flags. The Louisiana Purchase and the Alaska Purchase. Every once in a while, the U.S. government buys a piece of land so big and so unexpected, it feels like someone accidentally clicked Add to Cart on a continent. Enter the Louisiana Purchase and the Alaska Purchase. 2 mega real estate deals that redrew maps, freaked out Congress, and made America significantly roomier in the process. Start with Louisiana, 1803. Thomas Jefferson, America's philosopher-president, was a strict constitutionalist until France offered to sell the entire Louisiana territory for $15 million, and suddenly he was like, maybe the Constitution implies I can do this. The deal doubled the size of the United States overnight. Gone were Jefferson's qualms about executive overreach. In their place, a whole lot of prairie. Why was France selling? Napoleon had wars to fund and a sugar colony in Haiti that had just imploded in a slave revolt. He needed cash more than land. Jefferson pounced. The result? Land stretching from the Mississippi to the Rockies, purchased for about 3 cents an acre. Fast forward to 1867. Secretary of State William Seward orchestrates the purchase of Alaska from Russia for $7.2 million. At the time, people called it Seward's Folly. A frozen wasteland, they said, a barren icebox. But Seward, he saw value in its strategic location and natural resources. Spoiler, he was right. Alaska would become a treasure chest of oil, minerals, and regret for Russia. The eerie parallel is how both purchases seemed absurd at first. Risky, impractical, constitutionally murky, and yet both fundamentally altered the trajectory of the U.S. Louisiana gave us. The Midwest Alaska gave us geopolitical leverage in the Pacific and a future home for Sarah Palin. In both cases, the purchases were unpopular, debated, and then, years later, glorified as strokes of genius. America got bigger, stronger, and arguably a little weirder. And in both, the sellers, France and Russia, would probably like a refund. These weren't just land grabs. They were identity shifts. The U.S. went from scrappy colony to continental power, then from continental power to Arctic player. All thanks to a couple of unlikely bargains and presidents who knew when to sign the check. And if you think that's where the Roosevelt story ends, think again. Let's talk about the way both Roosevelts tried to remake the country's soul with 4-letter slogans and dangerously high expectations. Theodore Roosevelt's Square Deal and Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal. It's rare enough to have 2 Roosevelts in the White House. Rarer still when both decide to rebrand the entire American social contract with catchy 4-letter slogans that sound like political breakfast cereals. The Square Deal, the New Deal. Both bold, both sweeping, both determined to yank the country by the collar and say, "You're doing it wrong." Let's start with Theodore Roosevelt's Square Deal, unveiled in the early 1900s. It wasn't a piece of legislation. It was a vibe, a philosophy, a promise that the average American, the factory worker and the farmer, wouldn't get crushed under the boots of robber barons and trust-fueled monopolies. TR wasn't anti-capitalist. He was just tired of watching industrialists use the country like a personal ATM. His deal had 3 main points: conservation of natural resources, control of corporations, and consumer protection. The 3 C's of Roosevelt's reformist gospel. He went after corrupt meatpacking plants, shady railroads, and companies so large they required their own zip codes. His approach was aggressive, moralistic, and always theatrical. The presidential equivalent of kicking down the door and quoting John Locke. Now skip ahead to the 1930s. The Great Depression has flattened the economy, broken spirits, and left millions jobless. Enter Franklin D. Roosevelt, Teddy's cousin and philosophical heir, minus the hunting trophies. His New Deal wasn't just a philosophy. It was a legislative avalanche. Social security, unemployment insurance, public works projects, bank reforms, minimum wage laws. The federal government was no longer a distant referee. It was in the game and calling plays. FDR's New Deal reshaped the role of government, expanding its reach into almost every corner of American life. It wasn't perfect. It left out large swaths of people, especially Black Americans and women, and was constantly under legal attack. But it redefined the idea that government could and should do more than just exist. The eerie symmetry. Both Roosevelts launched their deals during times of upheaval. Both fought against entrenched interests, and both left legacies that permanently altered the scale and expectations of presidential power. And if you think presidential grandstanding is limited to policies and programs, wait until you see what happens when America decides to flex its muscle. Not in war, but by sailing around the globe in circles. The Great White Fleet, 1907 to 1909. and the around-the-world cruise of the USS Enterprise, 1964. When America wants to show the world how powerful it is, it doesn't always start wars. Sometimes it just sails a bunch of really intimidating ships around the globe like a kid doing laps on a bike, shouting, "Look what I can do!" The Great White Fleet and the 1964 around-the-world cruise of the USS Enterprise were both peacetime flexes, naval showboating on a grand geopolitical scale. Let's begin with the Great White Fleet. In 1907, Theodore Roosevelt, who else, ordered 16 U.S. Navy battleships painted bright white because subtlety is for losers, to circumnavigate the globe. This was not a tactical mission. It was theater. Roosevelt wanted to prove that America wasn't just a regional bully anymore. It was a global power. So he sent the ships on a 14-month world tour. Ports in South America, Asia, Europe. Salutes, parades, banquets. It was a masterclass in soft intimidation. Look at our steel. Look at our reach. The ships didn't fire a single hostile shot. But everyone got the message. Roosevelt even said, "Speak softly and carry a big stick." And this fleet was the stick, polished, painted, and set to cruise control. Now jump to 1964. The Cold War is in full swing. The U.S. Navy decides to send the world's first nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, the USS Enterprise, on an around-the-world trip. Dubbed Operation Sea Orbit, it was a non-stop journey covering over 30,000 miles in 65 days, without refueling. That's right, it was powered by nuclear reactors and pure Cold War swagger. The USS Enterprise didn't go around the world to fight. It went to show that it could. It was technological theater, American might, gliding silently on uranium. The coincidence is chillingly precise. Both missions were peacetime spectacles. Both were meticulously choreographed demonstrations of dominance. Both involved no direct conflict, just presence. And both reminded the world that America doesn't whisper, it sails. But more than anything, these global tours reflected how empires measure themselves, not just by borders or battles, but by posture, projection, mobility.